I want to begin by telling you something that took me nearly 20 years to say out loud, and I want to say it plainly, without drama, because the drama was never really the point. When I was 21 years old, my best friend looked at me across his kitchen table and said, "You know you don't have to keep pretending, right?" And I didn't answer him, because I didn't know which pretending he meant. I was pretending in so many directions at once that I'd lost track of which version of me was the real one. This is the story of how that happened, and more importantly, it's the story of how I found my way back to myself, or maybe forward to myself, through one of the strangest and most meaningful friendships of my life. If you're here because the title made you curious, I understand. But I want to promise you something before we start. This is not a story about shock or spectacle. It's a story about a confused kid who became a confused adult who became, slowly and painfully and imperfectly, a whole person. And if any part of that sounds like you, then I hope you'll stay, because I wrote this for you as much as for me. I grew up in a town that was small enough that everyone knew whose kid you were before they knew your name. My father worked maintenance at the local school district, and my mother ran the front desk at a dental office, and we lived in a house with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side, which my father always said he'd fix next summer, and never did. It was a good childhood, in most of the ways that count. I was fed, I was loved, I was read to at night. But there was a thread running through those years that I didn't have language for, and because I didn't have language for it, I assumed it was something wrong with me, something private and shameful that I needed to carry quietly and alone. The earliest memory I can point to is from when I was maybe 6 or 7. My older cousin Rachel had left a dress at our house after a sleepover, a simple blue cotton thing with white trim, and it ended up in the laundry pile that my mother folded on the living room couch while watching the evening news. I remember sitting on the carpet, supposedly playing with my toy cars, and being completely unable to focus on anything except that dress. Not because I wanted it in any way I could have explained, but because something about it felt like a question I didn't know I was allowed to ask. I remember the specific feeling, even now, decades later. It wasn't desire exactly. It was more like recognition, the way you feel when you hear a song you didn't know you remembered. When my mother held it up and said, "I'll have to give this back to Aunt Donna," I felt something drop in my stomach, and I had no idea why. I want to pause here and say something important because I think this is where a lot of people get confused about stories like mine. When I tell people about that moment, they often assume it meant something very specific and fixed about who I would become, as if a 6-year-old looking at a dress is a prophecy. But it wasn't like that. It was just a feeling, and feelings in childhood are weather, not climate. What mattered wasn't the dress. What mattered was what I did with the feeling, which was to bury it, because even at 6 years old, I had already absorbed from television and playground jokes and the way grown men talked about other men, that boys who cared about things like dresses were boys people laughed at. Nobody taught me that directly. Nobody had to. Culture teaches through 1,000 small signals, and children are the most sensitive receivers on earth. So I learned very young the skill that would define the first half of my life. I learned to divide myself. There was the boy the world saw, who liked baseball and rode his bike too fast down Miller's Hill and got decent grades and made his parents proud in all the ordinary ways. And then there was this other quiet thing inside me that only came out in specific, secret circumstances. When I was home alone, which happened more often once I was old enough to be trusted, I would sometimes stand in front of my mother's closet and just look. At first that's all it was, just looking. Then, when I was 9 or 10, I tried on one of her scarves, and I remember my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, not from excitement but from terror, the specific terror of a kid who knows he's crossing a line nobody drew for him, but everybody somehow enforces. I need to be honest about something here because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. Those moments in front of the closet were not joyful. They were not liberating. They were confusing and frightening, and they were always followed by a wave of shame, so heavy it felt physical, like something pressing down on my chest. I would put everything back exactly as it was, checking 3 times that the scarf was folded the same way, and then I would go sit in front of the television and feel like I was carrying a disease. That's the word my 10-year-old brain used, disease, because I had no framework for what I was feeling except the framework of sickness and wrongness that the world had handed me. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A 10-year-old child, sitting alone in his living room, believing he is diseased because he put a scarf around his neck.
Nothing happened to me.
Nobody caught me. Nobody punished me. The punishment was entirely self-inflicted, built from materials the culture had left lying around. And I think about how many kids are sitting in living rooms right now carrying that same weight, and it breaks my heart because I know exactly how heavy it is. Middle school made everything worse, as middle school does. Suddenly, the social machinery that had been humming quietly in the background became loud and explicit and merciless. Boys policed each other constantly. You could not walk wrong, talk wrong, laugh wrong, sit wrong, or show interest in the wrong things. The word gay was thrown around as an all-purpose insult for anything from a bad haircut to a wrong answer in math class, and I absorbed all of it like a sponge. I became hypervigilant. I studied the other boys the way a new employee studies the office culture, learning the rules by watching who got mocked and why. I modulated my voice. I changed my walk. I laughed at jokes that weren't funny and stayed silent about things I cared about. I became, by 8th grade, a genuinely convincing performer, and nobody, not my parents, not my teachers, not my friends, had any idea there was a second person living behind the performance. This is the part of the story where I want to offer something to anyone watching who might be doing the same thing right now. Hypervigilance feels like safety, but it's actually a slow poison. When you spend every waking hour monitoring yourself, editing yourself, translating yourself before you speak, you don't just hide from other people. You hide from yourself. By the time I was 15, I genuinely could not have told you what I actually liked, what I actually wanted, what I actually believed, because I had spent so many years being whatever the room required that the original settings were buried under layers of adaptation. Psychologists sometimes call this self-alienation, and I didn't learn that term until I was in therapy years later, but when I heard it, I sat in that chair and cried, because it was the first time anyone had given me a name for the thing that had been eating me since childhood. Names matter. Language matters. When you can name a thing, you can start to work with it instead of being worked over by it. High school was when Daniel entered the picture, and I need to tell you about Daniel carefully because this story would be nothing without him, and also because it's taken me a long time to understand what he actually gave me and what our friendship actually cost. Daniel transferred to our school's sophomore year. He was tall and unhurried and had the kind of easy confidence that I could only imitate, never inhabit. We were assigned as lab partners in chemistry, and within about 2 weeks, he had somehow become the person I ate lunch with every day. I never quite understood why he chose me. I was funny, I guess, in the defensive way that vigilant people are funny, always deflecting, always performing. Later he told me it was because I was the only person in our class who didn't seem to be trying to impress anyone, which is still one of the most ironic things anyone has ever said about me, because I was trying so hard I could barely breathe. I had just gotten very good at making the effort invisible. For 2 years, Daniel and I were best friends in the completely ordinary way. We played video games, we studied together badly, we drove around town in his ancient sedan listening to music and arguing about nothing. He dated a few girls. I dated one, briefly, a sweet girl named Megan who deserved a boyfriend who was actually present, which I was not, and who broke up with me after 3 months with the devastatingly accurate observation that it felt like I was always somewhere else even when I was sitting right next to her. She was right. I was somewhere else. I was always somewhere else, monitoring, managing, hiding. And then came the night that changed everything, and I've thought about how to tell this part for years, because it's the part the title of this video points at, and I want to tell it truthfully rather than dramatically, because the truth is more interesting than the drama anyway. It was October of senior year. Daniel's parents were out of town, and a group of us were at his house doing nothing in particular, and someone, I genuinely don't remember who, suggested a costume party for Halloween, and somehow the conversation spiraled into the boys daring each other to go in drag, because that was the kind of joke that 17-year-old boys in our town found hilarious, the idea of humiliating themselves in dresses for laughs. Everyone was laughing and volunteering each other, and I was laughing too, performing, always performing, when Daniel went quiet. I noticed because I noticed everything about him. And then he said, casually, almost carelessly, "I'll do it if Marcus does it."
Marcus is me.
And the room exploded with laughter and agreement, and I laughed along and said something appropriately dismissive, and the moment passed. But later that night, When everyone else had gone home and I was helping Daniel clean up, he said, without looking at me, while stacking cups, "You know, I only said that because I thought you might actually want to." And I stood there holding a trash bag and felt the floor of my entire life shift about 3 inches. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't have to. He knew. Somehow, in 2 years of friendship, through all my walls and performances and vigilance, Daniel had seen the thing I had hidden from everyone, including, in some ways, myself. And instead of mocking it, instead of exposing it, he had created a door and left it open and stepped back to see if I'd walk through. I didn't walk through it that night. I made a joke and changed the subject and went home and lay awake until 3 in the morning feeling like my chest was full of bees. But the door stayed open. And over the next few weeks, Daniel did something that I have never seen anyone else do before or since. He never pushed. He never mentioned it directly again. He just kept leaving the door open. He'd make offhand comments that created space, like mentioning a documentary he'd watched, or talking about a cousin of his who had come out and how his family had handled it well, and every time, he'd glance at me just slightly, just enough to say, "I see you, and it's fine, and whenever you're ready." Here's what I understand now that I couldn't understand then. What Daniel was doing was offering me the first unconditional acceptance I had ever experienced. My parents loved me, but their love, like most parents' love, came with a framework of expectations I could feel even when they weren't stated. Daniel's friendship, in that period, came with a message I had never received before in my life, which was, "I already know the worst thing you believe about yourself, and I'm still here, and I don't even think it's the worst thing. I don't think it's a bad thing at all." I cannot overstate what that does to a person who has spent 17 years believing they are fundamentally broken. It didn't fix me, but it cracked the shell, and things can only grow out of cracked shells. The costume party happened and I did it. I told everyone it was a dare, and everyone believed that because that was the story that made sense to them, and honestly, it was a story that made it easier for me too, because "I lost a bet" is a much safer explanation than "I have wanted to do this since I was 6 years old, and I'm terrified of what that means about me." Daniel's older sister helped with the clothes and the makeup, and she treated it with a cheerful matter-of-factness that I will be grateful for until I die, because she didn't make it weird. She didn't make it a joke. She just helped a nervous kid get dressed for a party. I remember standing in the bathroom looking at myself in the mirror, and I want to describe that moment carefully because it's the moment everything in this story pivots on. The feeling was not what I expected. I expected to feel ridiculous or thrilled or ashamed, something extreme. Instead, what I felt was quiet. For the first time in my conscious memory, the static in my head went silent. The constant monitoring, the translating, the vigilance, it all just stopped, and I stood there looking at a person in the mirror who looked like someone, not like a joke, not like a performance, but like someone, and I started crying silently in Daniel's bathroom while a party full of my classmates laughed in the next room. And Daniel, who had an almost supernatural sense for when I needed him, knocked on the door and I opened it, and he looked at me with tears running down through his sister's careful makeup work, and he just said, "Yeah. There you are."
Now.
I need to stop the story here and tell you the most important thing in this entire video, so if you've been half listening, come back to me for this part. That moment in the bathroom was real, and it was profound, and I will treasure it forever. But it did not solve anything. This is where most stories about identity exploration go wrong, in my opinion, whether they're told on stages or screens. They treat the moment of revelation as the ending, the climax, the resolution. The person sees their true self, the music swells, roll credits. But that moment in the bathroom was not an ending. It was barely a beginning. Because the very next day, I woke up in my bed, in my house, in my town, and I was still the same terrified kid. Except now I knew something I couldn't unknow, and knowing it made everything more complicated, not less. The months after that party were, honestly, the worst period of my life up to that point. And I think it's crucial to talk about this because nobody warned me it would happen, and maybe by telling you, I can warn someone else. I call it the aftershock, and I believe it's a real and common experience that doesn't get discussed enough. When you finally let yourself touch something you've denied yourself your whole life, you don't just feel relief. You feel grief. Grief for all the years you lost. Grief for the kid who sat in front of the television feeling diseased. Rage at a world that made you feel that way. Terror about what comes next. Confusion about what it all means. I had spent 17 years building a dam, and the dam had cracked, and what came through wasn't a gentle stream of self-discovery. It was a flood, and I nearly drowned in it. I became obsessed and avoidant in equal measure, which is a very uncomfortable combination. Some nights I couldn't think about anything else, replaying the party, imagining possibilities, falling down internet rabbit holes at 2 in the morning, reading the stories of strangers who seemed to understand my inner life better than anyone I'd ever met. Other nights I swung hard in the opposite direction, deciding the whole thing had been a phase, a weird one-off, an aberration, and I delete my browser history and throw myself into gym workouts and force myself to think about college applications. I ping-ponged between these poles for months, and the oscillation itself was exhausting, more exhausting than either pole alone. My grades dropped. I lost weight. My mother started asking if I was feeling okay, and I'd say I was fine, just tired, just stressed about senior year, and she'd accept it because I had been a reliable performer my whole life and my performances had always been believed. Daniel carried me through that winter in ways he doesn't even fully know, because I never told him how bad it was. He just kept showing up. He'd appear at my house with terrible movies and good snacks. He'd drive me around on the back roads outside town where nobody could see us, and he'd let me talk or not talk, and somehow he always knew which one I needed. Twice, at my request, halting and humiliated, he arranged for his sister to help me again, privately, just the three of us, and both times were gentle and ordinary and quietly sacred, and both times I went home afterward and cried for an hour and couldn't have told you if they were good tears or bad ones. They were both. Everything in that period was both. I want to say something directly to the younger people watching because I know some of you are where I was. What I was doing, in clinical terms I learned later, was ruminating, and there was nobody in my life trained to help me, and I didn't know that help existed, or that I was allowed to ask for it. If any of this resonates, if you are ping-ponging between obsession and denial, if you're carrying a secret that's eating your sleep and your appetite and your grades, please hear me. This is not something you have to white-knuckle alone. Counselors, therapists, even a trusted adult, these are not admissions of brokenness. They are tools. A drowning person who grabs a life ring is not weak. They're smart. I waited 5 more years before I grabbed the life ring, and I lost things in those 5 years I can never get back. Don't be me. Be smarter than me. It's a low bar, I promise. Graduation came, and with it, the question of college, and with that, the first great escape fantasy of my life. I chose a school 6 hours away, not for its programs, though it was a decent school, but because 6 hours felt like enough distance to become someone new. I think a lot of people do this in different ways for different reasons. We imagine that geography will solve what psychology can't, that the problem is the town, the people, the context, and not something we carry inside us. And it's true that distance helped, but not the way I expected. The freedom of college didn't liberate me. It just removed the guardrails, and I spent my freshman year learning, in slow motion, that when you've spent your whole life being what a room requires, and suddenly no room requires anything, you don't feel free. You feel like nothing. I had no self to return to. I was a performer without an audience, and the silence was deafening. Daniel went to school 2 states in the other direction, and we stayed in touch the way young men do, which is to say, irregularly and shallowly, and the distance between us grew, and I let it because being around Daniel meant being around the one person who knew my secret, and some days I couldn't bear being known. There's a lesson there it took me years to learn. We often push away the people who've seen us most truly, not because they've done anything wrong, but because being seen is terrifying when you haven't yet made peace with what's being seen. Daniel had become a mirror, and some days I couldn't look in mirrors. Freshman year, I made a decision that I now regard as one of the most consequential of my life, and I made it almost casually, the way you make your worst decisions. I decided to kill the part of me that had stood in that bathroom, crying with relief. I had a whole internal rationale. I'd experimented, the way people experiment, and now the experiment was over, and it was time to become a man, whatever I thought that meant. I grew a beard. I lifted weights obsessively. I joined a fraternity, which in hindsight was like a drowning man grabbing an anchor, and I performed masculinity with a desperate intensity that fooled everyone except, occasionally, me. I dated a girl named Lauren for most of sophomore year, and she was kind and smart and deserved so much better than a boyfriend who was using her as evidence in a case he was trying against himself. Here's what I want you to know about repression from someone who ran a 3-year controlled experiment in it. It doesn't make the thing smaller. It makes it bigger and hungrier and meaner. Whatever you refuse to feed at the table will eventually claw through the floorboards. The thing I was repressing didn't disappear. It metastasized into other things. Into insomnia, into a hair-trigger temper that wasn't like me, into a constant low-grade depression that I self-medicated with alcohol more weekends than not, into relationships where I was physically present and emotionally on another planet. Lauren broke up with me junior year, and her words echoed Megan's from high school so precisely that it was eerie. "You're never actually here," she said. "It's like dating someone's shadow." 2 women, for years apart, seeing the same absence in me. You'd think that would have told me something. It did, eventually, just not soon enough. The bottom, when it came, was not cinematic. Nobody found anything. Nobody confronted me. There was no dramatic discovery scene. The bottom was just a Tuesday night in November of my junior year, sitting alone in my dorm room, 3 beers into a 6-pack, catching my reflection in the dark window of my laptop, and having a thought arrive with total clarity and total calm. I don't want to do this anymore. And I didn't mean life. I want to be clear about that. I was never in that kind of danger, but I meant this. The performance. The vigilance. The war. I was 20 years old, and I was so tired of fighting myself that I could barely get out of bed. And I remember thinking with an almost clinical detachment that if I had spent the energy I'd spent on hiding on literally anything else, I could have built something extraordinary by now. The waste of it. The sheer waste of a mind and a heart consumed by concealment. That's what finally broke me. Not shame. Exhaustion and waste. So I did the thing I'd been too proud and too scared to do for 5 years. I walked, the next afternoon, to the campus counseling center, and I sat in the waiting room for 40 minutes composing and recomposing the sentence I would say, and when the counselor, a patient middle-aged woman named Dr. Okafor, asked me what brought me in, every prepared sentence evaporated, and what came out instead was, "I've spent my entire life pretending to be someone, and I don't actually know who I am, and I'm so tired." And then I cried like I hadn't cried since Daniel's bathroom, and she let me. And when I was done, she said the second most important sentence anyone ever said to me. She said, "That's not an unusual place to start. That's actually a very honest place to start. We can work with honest." I'm going to spend some time on the therapy years because I think they're the most important part of this story and the part that gets skipped most often. We love the before and the after. We skip the middle, the years of unglamorous work, because the middle doesn't photograph well. But the middle is where the change actually happens, and I want to honor it because Dr. Okafor and later a therapist named James, who I saw after graduation, gave me my life back, and the things they taught me are things I get to give you now. The first thing I learned is that the question I'd been tormenting myself with for years was the wrong question. I had been asking, what am I? As if identity were a diagnosis, a category, a box to find and climb into. Am I this or that, and which label fits? And what will it mean about everything else? And James said something in our 3rd session that rearranged my thinking permanently. He said, "You've been trying to answer, what am I, when the question that actually matters is, how do I want to live?" The first question is about classification. The second is about construction. One of them is answerable. And I sat there and realized I had never once, in 21 years, asked myself what kind of life I wanted. I'd only ever asked what kind of person I was permitted to be. Those are completely different questions, and they lead to completely different lives. The second thing I learned is that self-acceptance is not a feeling. I had been waiting to feel acceptance, the way you wait for a fever to break, passively, expecting it to arrive on its own. And it turns out acceptance is not a feeling at all. It's a practice. It's a series of small, repeated, often boring decisions. The decision to stop punishing yourself for a thought. The decision to say a true thing out loud in a safe room. The decision to look at yourself with the same compassion you'd offer a friend, which, let me tell you, is brutally hard when you've spent 2 decades as your own prosecutor. James made me do an exercise where I wrote a letter to my 10-year-old self, the kid in front of the television feeling diseased, and I couldn't get through 3 sentences without breaking down. And when I finally finished it, he had me read it aloud. And at the end he said, "Notice that you have never once spoken to that kid with cruelty in this letter. You love him. Now your whole job for the rest of your life is to learn to speak to yourself at every age the way you just spoke to him." I think about that exercise every single week of my life. If you take one thing from this entire story, take that. The third thing, and this one might be the hardest to hear, is that not everything I'd felt was about the cross-dressing itself. Some of it was, certainly, and I'll come back to that. But underneath it, braided through it, was something more universal. A desperate, starving need to be seen and loved as I actually was, rather than as I was performing. The clothes had become, in my psyche, a symbol of everything real, everything unperformed, everything mine. They were the one place the static stopped. And part of my work in therapy was untangling the symbol from the need, understanding that what I was really after, underneath everything, was permission to exist without armor. The clothes were one expression of that. But the armor was the actual problem. And armor, it turns out, is something you can work on directly, in every part of your life, in every relationship, in every room. During my senior year, as this work was slowly rewiring me, I did something terrifying. I called Daniel. We hadn't really talked in over a year, and I called him on a random Sunday and said, "I owe you about 100 conversations, and I'd like to start paying them back." And Daniel, being Daniel, said, "I was wondering when you'd call. I've been keeping the porch light on." And we talked for 4 hours, and then again the next weekend and the weekend after that. And over those calls I told him everything, the collapse, the fraternity performance, the exhaustion, the counseling, all of it, and he told me things I never knew, like how worried he'd been, how he'd almost called my parents' sophomore year, because the person in my social media photos didn't look like anyone he'd ever met, how he'd grieved the friendship and never fully given up on it. Rebuilding that friendship was one of the first real fruits of the work. It turns out that when you stop performing, the relationships you rebuild are built on bedrock instead of paint, and Daniel and I have been close ever since, 20 years now, in the easy way of people who have seen each other at their absolute worst, and chose to stay. I need to tell you about my parents now, and I've been putting it off in this narrative the same way I put it off in life, so let me just do it honestly. I didn't tell them until I was 25, 3 years out of college, living in a city, working my first real job, financially independent, and stable enough in myself to survive whatever came. I want to be careful here because I know some people believe you should come out to your family as early as possible, as a matter of principle, and others believe you should protect yourself indefinitely. I believe the timing is deeply personal and should be based on safety, stability, and readiness, not on guilt or obligation. You don't owe anyone information about your inner life before you can survive their reaction to it. That's not cowardice. That's tria. I waited until I could afford my own therapist and my own rent, and I have never regretted the timing, only sometimes the lost years of distance that hiding created between us. I told my mother first, alone, on a visit home, in the kitchen where I'd eaten 10,000 meals. I told her about the counseling, about the years of hiding, about what the hiding had cost me, and about the part of me that she didn't know, and I want to tell you her exact reaction because it taught me something about love. She was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "I have a lot of questions, and I don't understand most of this, and I need you to be patient with me while I learn. But I need you to hear one thing first. There's nothing you could have told me that would have made me stop loving you, and I'm heartbroken that you spent so many years believing otherwise, and some of that is on me and your father, and I'm sorry." And then she hugged me and we both cried, and then, because she is my mother, she made me a sandwich because grief and love in my family have always been handled with food. My father was harder. He didn't react with anger, which I'd feared, or rejection, which I'd feared more. He reacted with silence, with a kind of bewildered distance that lasted for months. He loved me, I never doubted that, but I had handed him something he had no framework for, and men of his generation and his town were given very few tools for processing things they have no framework for. What brought him around was not a conversation. It was time and my mother's quiet advocacy, and I think watching me become visibly healthier. Parents, whatever their confusions, can read their children's well-being like weather. When he saw that I was sleeping, laughing, building a life, that the haunted look I'd carried since adolescence was gone, the confusion didn't disappear, but it stopped mattering more than my happiness. 2 years later, fixing that same sagging porch together, he said, unprompted, while holding a board, "I don't understand it all."
But you seem like yourself now.
"You didn't before." And that was his way of saying everything, and I took it as everything because it was. Now, the part of the story you've perhaps been waiting for, if the title brought you here, is how the friendship with Daniel evolved into the thing the title gestures at. And I want to tell this part with particular care because it's tender and a little funny, and it matters to me that it's understood correctly. After college, Daniel and I ended up, by coincidence of job offers, in the same city, and we got an apartment together because rent was brutal and we were each other's favorite person anyway. And living together created something neither of us planned. We built a household where nothing needed to be hidden. I'd had private experiments before, furtive and shame-soaked, but now there was no furtiveness available, and what grew in its place was something I hadn't expected, which was normalcy. When nothing is secret, nothing is charged. I could be fully myself at home, all parts of myself, the guy who watched football and argued about movies, and occasionally, on a quiet weekend, the person I'd first met in that bathroom mirror, and Daniel treated all of it with the same unbothered acceptance he'd shown at 17. And here's where the title of this video comes from, and I want to handle it honestly, because the reality is both more ordinary and more meaningful than the clickbait version. Over those years, Daniel did become, in a real sense, the person who helped me discover and refine a part of myself I'd never been allowed to explore. He had an eye for it, it turned out. He'd been raised by a mother and sister he adored, and he understood things about presentation and style and self-possession that I had never had the chance to learn, and he taught me the way a brother teaches you anything, patiently, teasingly, with love disguised as mockery. There was an evening, maybe a year into our lease, when we were invited to a costume gala for his office, and we decided to go as a couple, me as his girlfriend, and we spent weeks on it, laughing, experimenting, his sister video calling and consultations, and when the night came, something happened that I had never experienced in public before. I spent an entire evening in a crowded room as the person from the mirror, and the world did not end. Nobody laughed. Strangers were kind. And Daniel, attentive and easy at my side all night, kept the whole thing feeling safe, and on the train home he said, "You know, you're a lot less anxious as my girlfriend than as yourself." And we laughed, but the observation lodged in me because he was right, and it took me another year of therapy to understand why. It wasn't the dress that calmed me. It was that the costume gave me permission to stop performing the other costume, the one I'd worn every day since childhood. And when you finally understand that the thing you thought was the costume is actually the skin, and the thing you thought was the skin is actually the costume, your entire life reorganizes around that discovery. For a few years, that part of my identity had a name and a life. Her name was Marie, a family name, my grandmother's, and she existed at home, at certain parties, in a small and carefully chosen circle of friends who knew and loved both of us, all of me. And I want to describe those years honestly, because they were neither the fantasy nor the horror that different audiences might imagine.
They were just life.
Marie made pancakes on Sundays. Marie argued with Daniel about whose turn it was to call the landlord. Marie went to a friend's birthday dinner and talked about books and had a wonderful, ordinary time. The extraordinariness of it, the thing I had spent my childhood believing was monstrous, turned out, in the light of acceptance, to be almost boring. And that boringness was the most healing thing I have ever experienced. The secret had been the sickness. When the secrecy died, the sickness died with it, and what remained was just a person, complete, unremarkable, at peace. Now I have to tell you about the complications, because a story about consequences was promised, and consequences there were, and honesty demands them. The first complication was romantic relationships, and I want to be very honest about this, because it's one of the hardest practical realities of a life like mine, and anyone walking a similar road deserves the truth rather than reassurance. Dating was genuinely hard. When do you tell someone? How do you explain something that took you 20 years to understand? to a person you've known for 3 dinners. I made every mistake. I hid it too long and torpedoed something good with a woman named Sarah, who found out not from me but from an old photo, and whose anger, I came to understand, was not about the thing itself, but about the deception, and she was right to be angry. I could have handled the truth, she said. What I can't handle is that you decided I couldn't. That sentence is tattooed on my conscience, and it should be. Hiding to protect someone is usually hiding to protect yourself, and calling it kindness doesn't make it kind. I also told people too early on first dates as a kind of defiant test, which wasn't honesty either, it was armor disguised as vulnerability. The balance, I eventually learned, is to tell the truth when the relationship is becoming real, as part of the ordinary unfolding of intimacy, not as a confession and not as a challenge. And I learned to accept, with grace, that for some people it would be a reason to walk away, and that was their right, and that a rejection of a part of me was survivable because I was no longer rejecting it myself. The second complication was fear, real-world fear, the kind that has nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with safety. There was an incident, the only one I'll describe, where leaving an event as Marie, a car of young men slowed and shouted things I won't repeat, and nothing physical happened, but I stood on the sidewalk shaking for 10 minutes afterward while Daniel kept an arm around me, and I understood, in my body, in a way I never had before, a fraction of what women and visibly queer people carry every day of their lives. I had spent my whole life believing that hiding made me safe, and it did, and that safety was real, and I want to honor that because advice to just be yourself, given without acknowledging that visibility carries real risks, is irresponsible advice. The world is not equally safe for everyone, and courage is not the absence of that calculation. Courage is making the calculation honestly, protecting yourself wisely, and refusing to let fear make all your decisions for you. I made choices about where and when to be visible, and I make them still, and I refuse to feel shame about choosing safety. Survival first. Authenticity second. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never had to pay the price of their own advice. The third complication was quieter and took me the longest to see. In the years when Marie was most present in my life, something subtle began happening that I didn't notice until Daniel, in his uncanny way, named it at, once again, a kitchen table. He said gently, "Can I ask you something? Do you ever feel like you're splitting again? Just in the other direction?" And I felt that same 3-inch shift of the floor I'd felt at 17. Because he was right. I had spent the first half of my life exiling Marie to a closet, and I had begun spending the second half exiling everything else to make room for her. I had built a new binary inside myself. Marcus handled work, family, the ordinary world, competence, armor. Marie handled softness, rest, creativity, vulnerability. And I had divided my humanity in half and assigned it to 2 names, and I was once again performing, just with better costumes. The vigilance had returned wearing a friendlier face. That conversation began the final and, I believe, most important phase of this whole journey, the phase I'm still in, the phase I expect to be in for the rest of my life. Integration. And this is the part one most want you to hear because I believe it's the least understood and the most valuable thing I have to offer. Integration means refusing the binary. It means understanding that the softness I called Marie was never a separate person. It was mine. It was me. It had always been me. The compassion, the creativity, the love of beautiful things, the capacity for tenderness, the parts of me that cried at that blue dress when I was 6, those were never a woman living inside a man or a secret self living inside a false one. They were aspects of one whole person who had been taught by a culture obsessed with sorting that his traits were sorted wrong. The problem was never the traits. The problem was the sorting. And the work of my 30s has been the slow, daily, unglamorous work of unsorting, of letting the whole person show up in every room as one person, without a name change or a costume change to mark which parts are allowed. I want to be very precise here, because this is a place where stories like mine can be misread in either direction, and I refuse to let my story be used as an argument I'm not making. My path to integration is mine. It is not a prescription. For some people, The truth of their identity is something much deeper and more fixed than it turned out to be for me, and their road to wholeness runs through changes I never needed to make, and those people have my complete respect and solidarity because I know the weight of the hiding they carried, whatever form their emergence takes. For others, what I call crossdressing is simply expression, play, art, joy, needing no explanation at all, and they are right too. The reason I tell my specific story is not to say that my destination is the correct one. It's to say that the question worth asking is never, which box do I belong in? It is, am I whole? Am I honest? Am I at peace? And are the people in my life loving me or my performance? Those questions have the same shape for everyone, whatever their answers look like. So what does my life look like now, all these years later, and what did it all amount to? The honest answer is that it looks quiet, and quiet is the point. I'm in my 40s. I live in a different city now. Daniel lives 20 minutes away with his husband, and their kids call me Uncle Marcus, and once, when their oldest was 9, he found an old photo of the costume gala and asked who the pretty lady with Uncle Daniel was, and Daniel, glancing at me for permission, said, "That's Uncle Marcus, dressed up," and the kids said, "Cool," and asked what's for dinner. And I stood in their kitchen with tears in my eyes over the sheer ordinariness of a 9-year-old saying cool to the thing that cost me 20 years of silence. That's the future, right there. The kids are fine. The kids have always been fine. It's the adults who taught us to be otherwise. There's a partner in my life these days, someone who knows the whole story, every chapter, told in the ordinary unfolding way I learned the hard way, and who stayed, and whose love is built on bedrock instead of paint. My mother calls every Sunday. My father and I fixed the porch, and then we fixed the fence, and then we ran out of broken things and had to admit we just liked the projects. Marie's dresses live in my closet, not hidden, not shrine-like, just clothes, and some of them I still wear on quiet Sundays when the mood strikes, and the pancakes taste the same as they always did, because they were always being made by the same person. The static never came back. The vigilance is gone. And on the rare occasions when I catch my reflection unexpectedly in a shop window, in a dark laptop screen, I no longer look away. I see one person, whole, unfinished, ordinary, and mine. If you're still here, you've been generous with your time, and I want to leave you with a handful of things I'd carve into a wall, if I could only carve a few. First, secrets are heavier than truths, always, even when the truth is heavy. Second, the question is not what you are, but how you want to live. Third, speak to yourself the way you'd speak to a child you love, because you are, in every moment, raising the person you'll be tomorrow. Fourth, the people worth keeping are the ones who see you and stay, and you will often find, as I did, that they were never as rare as your fear told you. And fifth, whatever it is you're carrying, whatever you've buried in a closet or a browser history or a locked drawer of your heart, you do not have to carry it alone, and asking for help is not the end of your dignity. It is the beginning of your life. I spent the first half of my life believing I was broken, and the second half learning that I was never broken, only divided, and that division, unlike brokenness, is something you can heal yourself from, one honest day at a time. My best friend didn't turn me into anyone. That's the truth behind the title you clicked on. He just held a door open and waited, for years if necessary, for me to walk through it as whoever I turned out to be. Everyone deserves a Daniel. And if you don't have one yet, maybe this story can hold the door open for you until you do. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.